who, after a process, a general collective process and a very personal process, became the monsters that they were. What do you have to do in order to become a cog in this murder machine? What do you have to give up in yourself in order to collaborate with this evil? What do you have to obliterate in yourself so you will be able to obliterate so many people without remorse, without regret, without almost feeling anything? What happens to a whole collective that goes through this process? And it was probably, I think, one of the two most difficult things to write in my life, to find Nigel, that's the name of this Obersturmbannführer, to find him inside to understand how it can happen to a human being, to not let go, to continue to be with him as much as I could, and at the same time to be Ansel Wasserman, the Jewish writer that the Nazi torments and later starts to be dependent on. This is also one of the real privileges of writing, that you can be two contradictory characters, totally contradictory, the most antipodes, yes, a Jew and a Nazi commander. And to allow both of them to be fully, to explore all their whole personality, all perspectives. Yeah, I don't think I answered your question, but this is what I can say. There was really a feeling that if I do not write this book, I cannot continue, I cannot go on. It's not putting myself in the dimension of the Shoah would really block me from being in my life in Israel back then in the 80s, as I said, as a father, as a writer, I think, because the Shoah for me is not only a Jewish matter, it happened only to the Jews, but I think it's a kind of a challenge, a moral question that every human being that was born after the Shoah must ask himself or herself. How everyone, I think, should ask himself or herself how I would have behaved had I been there as a victim and as one of the predators. It's really maybe the two basic moral questions that one should ask, and they are the criteria for many, many other questions that derive from that.
We will first open it up to students. I know they've read some of your work. Don't be shy.
No, they know.
We'll wait.
Not wrong.
Well, in the meantime, Matthias, right? You had a question?
Oh,
yeah.
yes.
He's a graduate student, right?
Well, I was an honorary student for the novelist class, not maybe a student. And my question was about genre. About genre of writing from the Netherlands. But in the US, I found there's this genre of creative non-fiction. And I found your book, The Yellow Wind, as a compliment. This is what made me miss my bus stop a few days ago. This is about the situation in Palestinian refugee camps before the Oslo process. So can you tell us a little bit about the process of writing creative non-fiction and how it relates to your creative work in fiction, if you would? Yeah, that's basically my question.
Yeah. I wrote The Yellow Wind in '87. I was approached by an Israeli magazine, Koteret Rashit, headline, it's called, and they asked me if I want to write an article of 3-4 pages to mention the 20th anniversary of the occupation. And I hesitated because I felt already the power that it has to change my life and I was not very willing back then to change my life, and I was in the beginning of writing another novel, and I had a very strong intuition that I'm going to lose this novel if I go to write what they thought would be an article, and it ended in a book. They asked me to write it because, as I told you before, 4 years before that, I wrote this novel about the occupation, The Smile of the Lamb. And they said, let's send him back there to the occupation and just to write, to document. I spent there 9 weeks. And gradually I was exposed to the reality of the occupation. And it's a reality that most Israelis have never been exposed to and preferred not to know of. And even if they knew vaguely, or they got used to the usual formulation and the usual cliches in which events in the occupation have occurred, there were kind of routine descriptions of all these events that usually were false descriptions that were whitewashed, so we shall not really feel the harshness of them, and will not have to really confront what they tell us about our situation and about ourselves. And I went there. I remember it was a very warm day. I took a bus from my home in South Jerusalem. I drove, 30 minutes to the refugee camp of Deheisha, half an hour. Rarely I did something like, never I did something like that. Rarely an Israeli who is not a soldier did such a huge leap or jump into an unknown country. And I went there and I entered the camp and I planted myself there. I was terrified. I tell you frankly, I was really deeply afraid. And people started to circle around me, and they didn't know, couldn't make who am I, because I spoke Arabic, I studied Arabic. And it was very obvious that I'm an Israeli, but they were really suspicious. What do I come to take from them? There were children whom for them I was the first Israeli they saw without uniforms. And I stood there under the Israeli sun, and I stood there, I think, for 2 hours, something like that, and they started to interrogate me, really to ask again and again, who sent you, what do you want, what do you want of us, do you work for the intelligence? And the heads, the young leadership of the camp came, and they also started to act very suspiciously. And then there was this old lady who cut through the lines of the men, grabbed me by the hand and said, Ta'al, come with me. She accepted me. And she took me by the hand to her little hut. And she said, you want to hear my story, yes? And I said, yes. And she started to speak. She started to tell me her story. She was a refugee from a village called Zakaria, somewhere in Israel. And she lived for almost 40 years in the refugee camp in those terrible conditions. And there are terrible conditions not only because of Israel, but because Arab countries decided to keep the refugees as a political statement against Israel. And cynically, they are using the very life of these refugees for decades just to serve as a political argument, because they could have solved their problems years ago. And the daughter in-law of this old lady started to talk. And other people started to pour into this little hut. And people started to tell their stories. I sat there, I had this notebook of school. I was writing, trying to document everything that they said. And they spoke, I think, for 5 or 6 hours. And the more people spoke, the more people came and poured in and wanted to tell me this story, because I think, and I think I'm right about it, that it was the first time after the 20 years of occupation that Palestinians got the chance to tell their story to an Israeli who was not against them. I was sympathetic, I felt sympathetic. I asked them questions, some of them were harsh questions, but they wanted to tell the story. And this how it started. I remember after that I came back to Israel. It was something like 9 in the evening. And I had to buy something in the main street of Jerusalem, in Ben Yehuda Street, one of the main streets of Jerusalem. And I walked there. And I remember how I looked at the people, my fellow, my Israeli people, friends, not friends, just people. And I thought that they have no clue what happens half an hour away from them, and that there is a big fire about to burst, and that they are totally naive, deceiving themselves, that there is such a great danger in their situation and they are not aware of it. And at that very night I started to write the story by Yael from what I heard from these women. I think that the effect that the book had in Israel back then was mainly because, not because of what it described, but because of the language in which it was told, because it did not use the usual cliches in which, as I said, we described the occupation. To make things a little more complicated for you, I will tell you that in those days, I was the main anchorman of the main news magazine in Israel, in the radio. This morning, I was the one who used to wake up the Israelis every morning for 4 years. Wake up, folks, we have wonderful bad news for you. Sometimes what I aired in 1 hour, I think, could be enough for Holland or Denmark for a century. The collection of atrocities and catastrophes and violence. And in my capacity as a radio person, I had to obey a special dictionary. There was a certain dictionary that was given to us, imposed on us, people who spoke to the microphone. For example, I was not allowed, of course, to say the occupied territories. They were not regarded as occupied, but as liberated. I was not allowed to say Palestinian, because God forbid, if I say they are Palestinians, they might think that they are really Palestinian, that they have a national identity. And God knows what they will do. There were so many false formulations and what I call later the whitewashed language. And at the same time, I was writing The Yellow Wind. Every day I used to finish my broadcast at 8 o'clock, going into my Auto Bianchi back then, driving into the territories, to the occupied territories, and spend the whole day there, coming back at night, waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning, doing the morning magazine, going back to the occupation for more than 2 months. And it became very, very clear to me back then that this situation contains explosives. I even remember I then interviewed the Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Shamir, the late Yitzhak Shamir, was a tough right-wing person, an extreme right-wing person. And I interviewed him for our Day of Independence in Israel. There's always the traditional interview that the Kol Israel sends a journalist to interview the Prime Minister about our national situation. So Mr. Shamir started to answer my questions that were quite provocative. It was, I think, maybe a month after the publication of the Yellow Wind, and then suddenly in the middle of the interview, he made the connection that I am this guy. And he just threw me out of his office. But before that, he shouted, "You and your leftist ideas, the Palestinians never had better life than they have now under our regime. They will never rebel against us because they know what is good for them." Our Prime Minister. Half a year later, the First Intifada broke up. So here you have it.
Additional questions?
Just to follow up briefly, what happened to the novel? You said you were afraid to
I
lose
lost it.
You
I
did
really
lose it.
lost it, yes. I knew I'm going to lose it, and yeah, it's, yeah. It was like an abortion in a way, because I had to put so much energy in writing The Yellow Wind, and then everything that happened also in my life following writing this book. And, well, but it's okay, you know. I now, as I told you, I start a novel, and I know that I might spend the next half year or year just imagining, walking. I'm walking, I told you, Yael. When I write, I cannot sit, at least in certain phases of the writing. I must walk. I don't know, there is a professor, a professor in Jerusalem who explained to me why do I have to walk and how it ventilizes the thoughts and everything. And I know that I might walk like that for a year and have a very good idea, and I will, you know, explore them and dig deep into them, and then in the end I will not write it, and maybe I will write another story. Maybe I will find out that the story that I'm writing now is only a scaffolding or a ladder to climb, and when I reach the head of it I can throw it away because there will be a more relevant story for me. But I really don't care, because being in this place of imagining it, or imagining, and the place of asking questions, because this is it's an act of asking questions, writing, all the time, every day, hundreds of questions that you ask about your characters and about the situation you describe and about yourself and your limitation. It's all the time asking questions. This is why I love writing fiction, because when I write documentaries, it's more like giving answers, yes, or giving conclusion, and I really like it less. And a novel has this potential, because of the questions that it arouses and imposes on you. It has the potential to change you, really to change you, to bring you to new places. And I so much wish that every novel that I write will change me, will bring me to a place that I was not able to be there before I was writing it. And sometimes it happens, unfortunately not every time, but sometimes it happens. Yes?
Excuse me, I read the book, and when I started it took me a while to realize there's no plot. I was prepared for a personal memoir, a novel of your own that would relate to what you were writing. So it took me a while to realize that's not what you've written. You've written basically an allegory. You've written sort of the lost version of every man. So as I read it, and I realized that you had chosen a way of removing yourself from an Israeli context, from a particularly Jewish context, with just the the idea of what it means to mourn very deeply, I really couldn't put it down. It just dragged me right through. So my question is, that's sort of the plug for the book, which is exceptional. I don't think, I think it's one of a kind. I've never read anything like it. I don't think I will again, actually. My question is, what you just said, you wrote this out of your own great personal pain and loss. What did it do for you?
I'm not sure literature should do something for the writer. It should be without any interest. But first, let me say, yes, there is not a plot there. I think I never thought. Actually, it's the first time I heard this argument. It's interesting, but I feel that even if we sit motionless in a closed room alone, there is a plot. And what it did, maybe I can just say that I don't know how I would have been able to continue my life had I not written it. That's what I know. So that's what it did. Yes.
I really found fascinating your discussion both of language and also this imagination, imaginative moving, sort of clearing away the levels of your own personality and constructing characters. And it's, you know, this idea of levels, or and talking about the way we protect ourselves by constructing levels that we are reluctant to break and so forth. I wonder if you've used that concept in thinking about the history of the society which you've lived in, Israel itself. I'm not really asking so much just about Israel, but I think, having just really become acquainted with your writing recently, makes me think again about Germany, which is a place that I've gone to quite a bit in recent years, and the history of the Germans since the war, dealing with the same, you know, the history, I mean, at least after the 60s, let's say, you begin to get this reconstruction within German culture about how it was possible that Germany could author this horrible crime, or set of crimes. Do you think that, I mean, my question is like in thinking about our societies, do you think this model that you're using in terms of imagining the person has some role? Because it seems to me that in the United States one can see assuming, you know, sort of layers of, and say in recent years, say the political life, you know, the language takes on new forms, people adopt new kinds of sensibilities. It's partly abetted by the media, but there's a kind of construction of sentiment and language and insight that makes social change more difficult or creates a kind of cultural crisis or something like that. And I wonder if, like in your experience in Israel, if you had that idea that culture was evolving in certain ways so that the society has become through its self-formation, culturally sort of layered in ways that affect its capacities, because that certainly seems to be, to me, to be the case in this country. And it seems like the Germans really tried to break the patterns of the past and create a quite, and I have many Jewish friends who couldn't imagine going to Germany, and then they end up visiting Berlin and think it's a great city, and I mean that's a trivial point, but I think there's something about the delayering and relayering that that's not just an individual phenomenon, but a social wide one. I wonder if you've reflected on that at all, or if you have any thoughts about that.
I guess that every one of us in every country, we are the last layer on many, many layers of memory and history and identity. But I will answer in a slightly different way. I thought when I was writing my latest book, which is not still in English, the horse who walks into a bar, and there is someone there who stands, and he's a stand-up comedian. He stands and he tells his very personal, harsh story of his life. And I noticed that the more I wrote him telling the story, I feel more movement within the story. Not in the very beginning, because I think usually, maybe I generalize, but I think usually each one of us, we have a kind of our personal story that we know how to convey it to others. It's our formal visit card, yes? We have some legislative stories taken from our life, from our biography, things that our parents did to us, or how it was with our brother and our first love, and how was our situation at school, and we think that this explains our situation today in the most effective way. And over the years, we, even not out of bad intention, but we learn how to polish this formal story, because we know how to tell it in the way that will be the most rewarding for us. It will gain the empathy and the sympathy of the listeners. It will portray us in a more beautiful or even or dramatic way, whatever is our need at this time. And after a while, we become prisoners of this official story, this formal story. And we don't even really realize to what extent it limits us and maybe even paralyzes us. And it dictates the continuity of this state of prisonhood in us, of lack of flexibility. And I think that, again, in writing, in telling a story, you have the chance suddenly to tell it in somewhat different ways. You know, when I was writing the book of intimate grammar about my childhood, not one-to-one, but of course it had to do with my own childhood. At first, in the first versions, I was totally immersed in my story as a child, as a young man in Jerusalem. And then gradually, after writing and rewriting and retelling it, I was able to infiltrate into the story another layer, maybe the layer of the parents of this tormented young man. For the first time, I was able to allow them to have their justification to their mistakes. Yes, suddenly I got some room to maneuver in a story that beforehand trapped me. Suddenly I was not trapped. And I think it also applies to collective stories of a whole nation. Every nation has its legislative stories and legislative concepts. Yes, in Germany it's, let's say, the Heimat. For us, the Jews, it's more, I think, the exile and the victimhood. For the Arabs, it's the story of the honor. Yeah. And you see that maybe in certain periods in the life of these people, it gave them significance and a sense of belonging and identity. And then you start to see after a while that this concept has congealed, that this national myth has congealed and suffocated them and prevents them from having or being able to explore different ways of life. And they become the victims of their own national myth. As I feel, we, the Jews, we become victims of our story of victimhood. Yes, we are paralyzed. We are unable to uproot ourselves from a certain predicament because we formulate our past and our present, and also we project it on the future, as if to doom ourselves in advance that we are doomed by divine decree to always be the ultimate other and the persecuted and the one who is, the whole world is against us, even when many in the world are not necessarily against us. And telling the story again and again gives you a kind of a second chance, a second instance, as if you appeal to court, to a kind of an abstract court, for a second instant. You can really have the chance to retell your own story, and by so doing to liberate yourself. And yeah, to find our ways to look at yourself as an individual and as a collective.
And we have time for one more, because
I'm afraid that in the evening I'm going to
Yeah,
say
yeah.
the same thing, but I covered everything, all history of the human being.
Any last question?
Could I just
Yeah.
push, so is that, I mean, in a way you're saying that storytelling is implicitly political.
Also, yeah.
So do you think that, I mean, that then tells us something about what we might want a critical politics to look like? Because you're suggesting, I mean, I think your idea that these layers are stories is certainly part of the truth. It may be even more complicated, that layers are aspects of, maybe more abstract and so on, but maybe stories are the key to establishing shifts in common political discourse. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah.
And
I think it's a political act, yes.
So Bernie Sanders, for example, is telling a story that, I mean, just for us in this sort of narrow way, he's sort of saying, well, we can tell the story of what's happening in the U.S. and it's very different than this other story. And then it becomes a question of whether that story can be elaborated, made plausible, concretized.
I think it's hard to set a criteria to say which, of course, you cannot say which story is more truthful, of course, because each one of them represents some truth, I guess. But maybe the criteria is which one of the stories allows us more freedom, more inner freedom, even inner freedom vis-a-vis our own history.
I mean, if I could jump in there, because it seemed like in an interview, I think also at Paris Review, you were saying something about the left has won because they've succeeded in shifting the discourse in Israel, that even the right has adopted certain language that before they wouldn't have. And your example in the Yellow Wind of, that to us now to hear that it was anathema to talk about the occupation, but rather it was the liberation. In some ways, the fact that that story sounds silly to us now would be an example of how you, through the Yellow Wind and maybe some other writers as well, shifted the story, right? The counter story took hold, and now it's,
Even Elliot Sharon said it, but, right, even Elliot Sharon used those terms, right? So,
Yes. In that sense, I think the left imposed